Hello and welcome back to a video of repairing my old rowboat. As you can see, I went to the lumberyard. I picked up some white oak boards that are here, which will make up my frames, the transom, and some of the runners on the bottom of the boat. I went to Highland Hardwoods in Brentwood, New Hampshire, and picked out a bunch of white oak boards. This is like going to a candy store for a woodworker. Um, a really good place to go buy some hardwoods. And I have 3 sheets of marine plywood here, which will do the bottom and the sides. I could not get any 3/8 inch fir marine plywood, so I went with the 9mm Meranti plywood, which measures about 3/8 also. Even though it's not the same plywood as what was originally used, this will make a good plywood that will last for a long time on the sides and the bottom. The reason I go with marine plywood is you can see here on the plywood it is completely filled. There are no voids anywhere, and this is really good plywood to work with. Also, the plies are very thin and there is a lot of them here. This is a piece of just lumberyard pine plywood, and you can see that the plies are much thicker. There's only 4 plies here, even though this is a thicker plywood. This is 1/2 inch and this is 3/8 marine, so this is actually thicker, but it only has 4 plies here. But you can also see that there are some voids in this plywood, which will not make it really good wood for a marine application. I have built some boats before with just lumberyard plywood, and actually it has lasted quite well for the use that it has gotten. But the marine plywood is definitely a much nicer plywood. If you can afford it, maybe 3 times as much as lumberyard plywood, but it definitely is a much better product. At first, I had thought I would be able to save part of this transom and reuse it, but after taking things apart, I can actually take my screwdriver and just drive it into some of these places on this transom here, and so there isn't much in the old transom that I can save, but I was able to take it apart and save that so I could get some pretty accurate measurements off of it. And so I have my new pieces made up. I was even able to replicate all these angles that are here. So it was quite useful to still have the old transom. It will be a brand new transom in this boat. So this is what my transom is starting to look like at this point. I've got all of the cutouts on the side done. My friend Kyle used his CNC machine to cut out the name on it through here saying Driftwood 2. So my friend programmed that name Driftwood 2 onto the transom, and then his CNC machine cut it out for us. My friend has K. Duke's design, and I'll put a link in the description below to his YouTube channel. When the CNC machine was cutting out the lettering, there was this one spot here where something happened with the programming, and it cut this out here, which it shouldn't have. So I will go through and will show you how I'm going to repair that. When I cut the transom out, I did save a couple of pieces of board that came out of the same board, so they match perfectly the color right here in the grain pattern. I will router out a little section here and use this piece as a patch to fill this in. When I first started out doing carpentry work, I worked with an older man, and he always used to tell me that if you don't make any mistakes, it's because you aren't doing anything. At the time, he seemed like an old man, but now the reality is I am older than he was at that time, and so I still appreciate his words of wisdom. So to do this repair, I'm going to make up a jig, and I just have a scrap piece of 1/4-inch plywood here, and this also is just a scrap piece of wood. But the one thing you want to make sure with piece of wood is that it is nice and straight. You don't want something that has a curve to it. And I just take a little bit of glue on it. This you probably don't need glue, but it stays together better if you want to use it for longer period of time or for different projects. And it doesn't really matter where I put this board on here. And then I'll just put a few staples into it. So that's what that looks like. And then I have my router set up with just a straight bit in it. And I will take and just run this across that board. So by doing this, I know that my router is going to cut exactly at this spot. So then I can just take this jig and I can clamp it wherever I want to here, and then I can router this area out, and I know that my router is going to cut exactly at this spot here. So I have my jig clamped onto my workpiece here at the spot where I want to make my joint here. And I know my router will be cutting at this exact spot, so I can just put it there where I want it to cut. So this is what my cut looks like here. It burned just a little bit because I went quite slow with the router. That won't be showing, so I'm not that concerned about that. So now this is the piece that is fitted in there. As you can see, it fits pretty good. I will be mixing up some epoxy in a little while to glue my transom together. I'll glue this little piece in with epoxy. It's a little bit sticking up a little bit here, but once that's all glued in, I'll sand it off flush. I'll just carve the rest of this lettering in by hand and make it all match in. Here I'll just show you again how I use these patterns. When I had put this pattern inside the boat, I had used this piece of plywood and marked from the outside of the boat here to this line, which is on my pattern. And now I just laid this piece of plywood directly on that line, and then I mark here, which represents again the outside of that board. And then put my straight edge on this top mark, which was the mark that was across the gunnels of the boat, and that makes the top of my frames when I mark it here. So now I can move my pattern back. I have a pattern here now that is identical to what the inside of the boat sides were, or the outside of the frame that I'm working on. So I can build my frame and follow these lines. So all my frames were 2 inches wide, the boards that I would use. So I'm going to rip a bunch of boards up 2 inches wide here. Here I am laying out the frame stock that I had just cut up on those patterns that I had made up, and I will cut these boards up to length, and that will make my frames, which will go into the boat to hold the sides of the boat together in the bottom of the boat. So now I have all my frames cut out and ready to be glued. My transom, I have dry fitted that, and it's all ready to be glued. I'm going to be using some epoxy here to glue everything together. I'm going to be using the Total Boat brand, but there's lots of different brands that work quite well. Also, West System is another really good brand. I like the Total Boat because it's a little less expensive than West System, and I really don't see much difference. I don't get paid by them or sponsored by them, but I just happen to like their product. When I go to mix epoxy, I lay everything out that I think I'm going to need and have it close and handy. Use the pumps to mix your epoxy, which you can buy them with the kits. But sometimes I just mark out my mixture. This is a 5-in-1 mix, so it's 5 parts of resin to 1 part of hardener. You can buy the pre-marked containers and just measure out however much amount you want in these containers, but usually these containers mix a lot more epoxy than what I want to use. So I just mark out, like here I marked out, actually I marked out 30 milliliters of hardener and then 150 milliliters of resin, which will make Um, Somewhere 180 milliliters or 6 ounces, somewhere in that area, which will be plenty for what I'm going to be using. I like to mix them in a clear plastic cup. I like to get cups that have straight sides on them and not a lot of wrinkles or different things for epoxy to get caught up in. And then I just cut a stick for my mixing stick. You can buy the special mixing sticks, but they always have a rounded end to them, which when you're mixing in a container, I like to have a flat end because you can get right down in at the bottom and mix everything nicely. So I always just use a scrap piece of wood, just cut off square to mix. So I'm going to start out by mixing my epoxy. I have my marks on my cup here, and I will put some resin in there up to that first mark. Let me get that up there where I can see it, and it's right there. And then that was hardener. Now it's going to be my resin. Will go up to that top mark. And then they say to mix it for about 1 to 2 minutes. And one of the important things to remember when you mix this is to always scrape up your bottom and get anything that's at the bottom into your mixture. Always use rubber gloves. Depending on what kind of epoxy you buy, that determines how long you're going to have for work time. This epoxy is going to give me about 45 minutes of work time, so I don't really have to rush to use up my epoxy. I always only mix up basically about what I need, and then if I have any left over, I will coat some of the areas that I know are going to need to be coated later on, because I just don't like wasting epoxy. It always seems like 1 to 2 minutes is a long time for mixing, but they do say you have to mix it pretty well. If not, they don't mix good enough. So mixing it a little bit longer than what you think is okay, because if in the long run it makes it work better, why not? I usually use these throwaway brushes. They seem to work quite nicely. Then coating the surfaces, you want to be pretty liberal with putting epoxy on there, and I usually coat the surface. I'll coat both surfaces and just let them set there for a few minutes till some of the epoxy has soaken into the wood before I clamp things together. And I coat both surfaces of this wood. One of the common issues with working with epoxy is what's called starving the epoxy, and that is not putting on enough epoxy, or else when you clamp things, you don't want to clamp it too hard so that it squeezes all the epoxy out, because epoxy needs to have there needs to be some epoxy in there for it to stick together. Regular wood glue, you can get away with clamping it a lot more than epoxy. Epoxy, you need to leave some of the glue in there for it to bind together. The wood also soaks up a lot of the epoxy when you first put it on. This is white oak, and white oak won't soak up near as much as some of your softwoods. When you're working with pine or cedar, they will soak up a lot more. Epoxy is a glue that seems to be quite slippery, so pieces move around on you when you're gluing. So you need to make sure everything lines up good. Once you get a lot of squeeze out like that, it is about all that you want to clamp. Maybe I'll clamp something like that. And that's about all you want to clamp. You don't want to squeeze it enough so everything squeezes out. I'm going to put a clamp in the center here. And one of the things I want to do with this clamp is, when I dry fitted this, I realized this piece here, that one is lower than this piece. So I'm going to clamp this in here. At that stage. And then I'll just use this little shim here, put this in, and I will drive that in until that they're fairly flat here. That's pretty good. So that's all I need to do for clamping that up. Also going to put in this little piece which I had fitted in before. So I will, this is a little filler piece for the mistake that was made in the CNC routing. So I will just fill this in. Get everything well coated here. And this piece, I am just going to, I am not going to clamp it in or anything. It's just going to go in there. It fits in very nicely. So that's all I need to do with that. When I glue these frames together, there will be a lot of end grain, which will soak up a lot of epoxy. So I will just go along and coat everything where it's going to get put together and just let it set for a few minutes. So I've allowed these pieces to sit for about 10 minutes now. And so I'm just going to give them another coat of epoxy so that then there's plenty of epoxy on there. And I'm going to just lay them out. I don't have a good way of clamping these pieces together, so I'm just laying them out on the lines that I have made for the frames, and as long as they stay there pretty well for the next couple of hours, they should be okay. Then I will coat some of this so that any epoxy that is puddled up on top will run into the joint and fill these joints all up. These frames will have a piece like this that will get put on the top and on the bottom of this frame. So this is just the first glue up, but I will be gluing these up a little bit more later on. So I'm going to start carving out this D again. You can see I've marked out with some lines where the top of those grooves should be. So now this is what that transom looks like. At this point I have put one coat of epoxy on it and have sanded it, and this is where that repair was done in that D, and it matches up pretty good. Hope you enjoyed looking at this video. In my next video I will be sanding down the bow of the boat and putting together a few more parts. Then I will start assembling the boat back together again. If you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching.